Cellar Creek had always been a small, quiet town tucked away in the dense forests of northern Oregon. With a population of just over 1,000, the town relied on its timber industry and the few tourists who came seeking nature's solace. But in early 2024, Cellar Creek became infamous for reasons far darker. It began in February. Snow blanketed the town, muffling sound and isolating it even further from the outside world. Residents reported a strange hum that seemed to vibrate in the air at odd hours. It wasn't constant, but when it came, it resonated deep in the bones, unnerving even the most rational minds. The hum coincided with a series of disappearances. The first was a local handyman, Mitch Harris. Mitch had gone out to fix a generator at the old Reynolds farm on the outskirts of town. He never returned. When a search party went looking for him the next day, all they found was his truck still running with the headlights on. The snow around the vehicle was undisturbed, as if Mitch had simply evaporated. Within days, 3 more people vanished: a high school teacher, a waitress, and a retired forest ranger. Each disappearance was marked by the same eerie hum and no signs of struggle. Sheriff Elaine Parker, a pragmatic woman with decades of experience, struggled to make sense of it. "People don't just disappear," she told the townsfolk during a tense town hall meeting. But in Cellar Creek, they were the strangers in the woods. Adding to the unease were reports of shadowy figures in the woods. Hunters and hikers claimed to see tall, faceless silhouettes watching them from a distance. They'd vanish the moment anyone tried to approach. Jacob Renshaw, a young man known for his skepticism and loud mouth, dismissed the stories as mass hysteria. That is, until he came running into town one night, pale as a sheet. "They're out there," he stammered to Sheriff Parker, trembling uncontrollably. "They don't move like us. They don't feel real." Jacob had been out hunting deer when he stumbled upon one of the figures. He described it as towering and almost human, but its limbs were too long, its movements jerky, as if it were a puppet on invisible strings. Worse, it had no face, just smooth, featureless skin where eyes and a mouth should have been. After that, Jacob refused to leave his house. 2 weeks later, he was gone too. His front door was wide open, his shotgun lying on the floor. A fresh snowfall had covered any tracks. A desperate plan. By March, half the town had either fled or vanished. Those who remained were too scared to leave their homes after dark. The hum grew louder, sometimes accompanied by strange lights flickering in the woods. Sheriff Parker, at her wit's end, decided to call in reinforcements. She reached out to state authorities, but snowstorms and downed power lines made communication nearly impossible. One night, Parker's deputy, Sarah Mills, proposed an audacious plan. "If we can't call for help, we'll go to the source. Whatever's out there, we confront it. We're not going to survive by hiding." It was a suicide mission, but Parker agreed. She recruited a small team of volunteers, hunters, farmers, anyone brave enough to venture into the woods. Equipped with flashlights, rifles, and radios, the group set out on a frigid March evening. The hum was louder than ever, almost unbearable, and seemed to pull them deeper into the forest. After hours of searching, they found a clearing where the trees had been unnaturally twisted into arches. In the center of the clearing stood a monolithic black structure, smooth as glass and pulsating with an eerie light. The team was mesmerized. "What is it?" one man whispered, his voice trembling. "Doesn't matter," Parker said firmly. "We're taking it down." The confrontation. As they approached the structure, the air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Shadows began to emerge from the trees, circling the group. The faceless figures were back, moving faster now, almost gliding. One of the hunters panicked and fired his rifle, the gunshot echoing through the clearing. The bullet never hit its target. Instead, it stopped mid-air, as if swallowed by the very atmosphere. The shadows surged forward, and chaos erupted. Flashlights flickered, and radios emitted nothing but static. Parker yelled orders, but her voice was drowned out by the hum, now deafening. Sarah Mills was the first to fall. A shadow engulfed her, and she vanished without a sound. One by one, the others disappeared, until only Parker remained. She aimed her rifle at the monolith and fired, but the bullet dissolved on impact. In a last desperate act, she hurled her flashlight at it, and for a brief moment, the structure's light dimmed. Then everything went black. The aftermath. When dawn broke, Parker woke up in the clearing, alone. The monolith was gone, as were the shadows. She stumbled back to town, only to find it completely deserted. Houses stood empty, doors swinging open in the wind. Cellar Creek was a ghost town. State authorities finally arrived weeks later to investigate. They found Parker wandering the streets, incoherent and muttering about the shadows. Despite extensive searches, no trace of the missing residents was ever found. Parker was placed in a psychiatric facility where she remained silent, staring at the walls. Over time, Cellar Creek faded from public memory, becoming just another unsolved mystery. But those who dared to venture near the abandoned town swore they could still hear the hum, faint and far away, like a warning to stay away. In the remote hills of West Virginia, redstone mines had long been a source of fascination and fear. Once a booming coal mining operation, the mines had been abandoned in the 1950s after a series of unexplained accidents claimed the lives of over 100 miners. Since then, locals told stories of eerie lights flickering deep within the tunnels and disembodied voices echoing through the hills. By 2024, most people had written it off as just another ghost story. But then, the disappearances began. It started with a group of urban explorers. In January, 4 friends from out of state ventured into the mines, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a thirst for adventure. They were never seen again. Authorities conducted a search, but the mines were a labyrinth of collapsed tunnels and unstable shafts. After weeks of fruitless searching, the case was closed, and the mines were declared off-limits. The call for answers. In March, Marianne Blake, a journalist for a small online magazine, became obsessed with the story. She was drawn not just by the mystery of the missing explorers, but by the mine's dark history. Rumors swirled that the accidents in the 1950s were not accidents at all, but the result of something buried deep underground, something that should never have been disturbed. Marianne's determination to uncover the truth led her to Redstone. Accompanied by her cameraman, Victor Ruiz, and a local guide named Dale McCarthy, she planned a 2-day expedition into the mines. Despite warnings from locals and the sheriff, Marianne insisted they take the risk. "The truth needs to come out," she told Dale, who reluctantly agreed. Into the depths, the trio entered the mines on a crisp March morning. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying the metallic tang of old machinery and the earthy scent of decay. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating rusted rails and collapsed beams. Victor filmed everything, his camera capturing the oppressive atmosphere. The first day was uneventful. They explored several tunnels, finding only abandoned equipment and graffiti left by previous trespassers. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. Strange sounds echoed through the tunnels, a faint tapping, like someone hammering deep within the earth. Dale tried to dismiss it as the natural creaks and groans of an old mine, but Marianne wasn't convinced. "It's too rhythmic," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like, communication." Victor captured her unease on camera, his own expression growing tense. "Let's just stick together," he suggested. The shadow in the dark. That night they set up camp in a small chamber near the entrance. Victor reviewed the footage on his laptop while Marianne and Dale prepared a simple meal. As they ate, the tapping grew louder, closer. Then came the whispering. It started faint, like a breeze carrying fragments of words. But soon it became distinct, a chorus of voices speaking in low, guttural tones. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was menacing. Marianne clutched her flashlight, scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just a sudden, deafening silence. Then, from the far end of the chamber, a shadow moved. It was not cast by their lights, but a dense, shifting darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Victor gasped, his camera trained on the figure. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Before anyone could respond, the shadow surged forward, extinguishing their lanterns. Panic erupted. Victor yelled as something unseen yanked his camera from his hands. Dale shouted for everyone to run, but the darkness was disorienting. Marianne felt an icy hand grip her arm, pulling her deeper into the mine. The labyrinth. When Marianne awoke, she was alone in a narrow tunnel. Her flashlight was broken, leaving her in near total darkness. Only the faint glow of her phone screen provided any light. She called out for Victor and Dale, but the only response was the echo of her own voice. Desperate, she stumbled through the tunnels, using the phone's dim light to guide her. The tapping returned, now more erratic, accompanied by guttural breathing just beyond her range of vision. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with each step. Marianne's phone died, plunging her into complete darkness. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm her, she saw a faint light ahead. She hurried toward it, emerging into a massive cavern. In the center stood an ancient altar, surrounded by skeletal remains. The light emanated from the walls, which pulsed with a sickly green glow. Carved into the stone were symbols Marianne couldn't decipher, but they radiated malevolence, the revelation. As Marianne approached the altar, she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find the shadow figure looming over her. Its featureless form seemed to shift and writhe, and its voice filled her mind rather than her ears. "You should not be here," it intoned. "This place was sealed for a reason." Marianne backed away, her heart pounding. "What are you?" she managed to whisper. The figure extended an elongated arm toward the altar. "We are the guardians, the ones who keep it contained. You have disturbed the balance." Suddenly the cavern shook, and a deep roar echoed through the tunnels. The glow from the walls intensified, and a fissure opened in the ground. From it emerged a mass of writhing, clawed limbs and glowing red eyes. Marianne screamed as the entity began to consume the skeletal remains, growing larger with each second. The shadow figure turned to her. "Run!" The escape Marianne fled, the roar of the creature and the collapse of the cavern driving her forward. She tripped and stumbled, but managed to find her way back to the entrance. As she burst into the daylight, she collapsed, gasping for air. She was alone. Victor and Dale were never found. The aftermath. Marianne's footage was recovered, though much of it was corrupted. The fragments that remained showed glimpses of the shadow figure and the altar, but the climactic events were inexplicably missing. Authorities dismissed her story as hysteria, but locals whispered that she had unleashed something terrible. The mines were sealed once more, but the tapping could still be heard by those who dared venture too close. And at night, faint green lights flickered in the hills, a reminder that Redstone's darkest secret was far from contained. In the summer of 2024, a group of hikers set out to explore the dense wilderness of Blackwater National Park in Montana. Known for its breathtaking views and sprawling pine forests, the park also had a darker reputation among locals. They called it the Whispering Forest. For decades, visitors had reported hearing voices that seemed to emanate from the trees, calling their names in hushed, beckoning tones. Most chalked it up to overactive imaginations. But for 7 hikers, the whispers became very real and deadly. The hikers. The group consisted of seasoned adventurers and first-time trekkers. At the lead was Eric Kane, a survival expert who had spent years guiding tours through some of the country's most challenging terrains. Joining him were his younger sister, Lily, a nature photographer. Mark and Rachel, a newly engaged couple looking for one last adventure before their wedding. Tyler, a thrill-seeker who prided himself on taking risks. And Grace and Noah, siblings with a love for the outdoors. The trip started uneventfully. The group set up camp near the park's main trail and spent the first day hiking to a scenic overlook. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves, and everyone was in high spirits. But as the sun began to set, an unnatural stillness settled over the woods. The birds went silent, and the wind stopped. That's when they first heard it. "Eric," a voice whispered, faint and distant. Eric froze, his head snapping toward the sound. "Did someone just call my name?" he asked. The others shook their heads, but the unease was palpable. They decided to return to camp before nightfall. The first night. Around the campfire, the group laughed off the strange occurrence, attributing it to the wind or an animal. But as the fire died down and they settled into their tents, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, circling the camp. "Lily, Mark, Grace." Each name was spoken softly, almost lovingly, yet it sent chills down their spines. Tyler, ever the skeptic, unzipped his tent and shone a flashlight into the woods. "Who's out there?" he shouted. There was no response, only the sound of branches snapping in the distance. "Probably just some pranksters," he muttered, but the others weren't so sure. By morning, everyone was on edge. Lily had hardly slept, convinced she'd seen shadows moving between the trees. Mark and Rachel argued about whether they should cut the trip short. Eric insisted they stay together and stick to the plan. Deeper into the forest. As they ventured further from the main trail, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The whispers grew more persistent, now accompanied by soft laughter and the faint sound of footsteps. Noah, the youngest of the group, tried to lighten the mood by cracking jokes, but his forced humor only made the tension worse. Grace snapped at him, her nerves fraying. "Just stop, okay? This isn't funny anymore." That afternoon, they stumbled upon an old cabin hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, its roof caved in and walls covered in moss. Eric suggested they check it out for supplies, but Lily and Rachel refused to go near it. "It feels wrong," Lily said, her voice trembling. Tyler, on the other hand, couldn't resist. He and Eric ventured inside while the others waited nervously. The cabin was empty except for a single wooden table, on which sat an old, rusted lantern. Scratched into the table's surface were words that sent a chill through Eric. "They see you, They want you. The first loss. That night, Noah disappeared. He had gone to fetch water from a nearby stream and never returned. The group searched for hours, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. They found his water bottle lying on the ground, but no other trace of him. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic. "Noah," they called, "come to us." Eric forced everyone back to camp, promising to resume the search at first light. But by morning, they found themselves hopelessly lost. The forest seemed to shift around them, familiar landmarks vanishing or appearing in the wrong places. Even Eric's compass spun uselessly. The descent into madness. Over the next 2 days, the group's cohesion shattered. Mark became paranoid, accusing Tyler of sabotaging their trip. Rachel broke down in tears, clinging to Lily for comfort. Grace wandered off, mumbling to herself and swatting at unseen things in the air. Tyler was the next to vanish. He'd insisted on scouting ahead, despite Eric's protests. Minutes later, his screams echoed through the forest, abruptly cut off. When they followed the sound, they found nothing but his flashlight, still flickering weakly on the ground. By now, the whispers had become relentless, overlapping and deafening. The voices taunted them, laughed at them, begged them to come closer. Shadows danced just beyond their line of sight, always watching. The truth revealed. On the 5th day, Eric, Lily, Mark, and Rachel stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an enormous tree, its bark blackened and twisted, its roots digging into the earth like claws. Hanging from its branches were dozens of totems made of bone and string, swaying despite the lack of wind. "This is it," Eric said, his voice hollow. "This is where it's coming from." The whispers crescendoed as the group approached the tree. Mark suddenly screamed and collapsed, clutching his head. "They're inside my head," he cried, his eyes rolling back. Rachel tried to help him, but the moment she touched him, her body went rigid. Her head snapped back, and a guttural growl escaped her lips. Lily grabbed Eric's arm. "We have to go, now." Eric hesitated, torn between saving his sister and confronting the source of their torment. But the decision was made for him when the ground beneath the tree split open, revealing a pit of writhing, shadowy forms. Tendrils of darkness shot out, dragging Mark and Rachel into the abyss. The escape. Eric and Lily ran, the forest seeming to close in around them. The whispers pursued them, growing louder and more desperate. When they finally burst out onto a road, they collapsed, gasping for air. A passing motorist found them and called for help. The aftermath, Eric and Lily survived, but they were forever changed. Authorities dismissed their story, blaming the disappearances on a combination of poor planning and natural dangers. But Eric knew the truth. The forest was alive, and it had claimed his friends. Blackwater National Park was quietly closed to the public later that year. Officially, it was due to environmental concerns. Unofficially, those who lived nearby knew better. They could still hear the whispers on quiet nights, calling out for anyone foolish enough to listen. In the winter of 2024, a peculiar antique shop opened in the quiet town of Brookhaven, New York. Its owner, an enigmatic man named Mr. Ralston, claimed to have collected rare artifacts from around the world. Among the shop's eclectic inventory was a large, ornate mirror, framed in dark mahogany and adorned with intricate carvings of strange, twisted figures. From the moment it was displayed, the mirror drew attention and unease. Locals whispered that the carvings seemed to shift when no one was looking. Some claimed they felt an inexplicable chill when standing near it. But the mirror's most peculiar trait was its ability to reflect things that weren't there. The purchase, Jenny Harlow, a history teacher with a fascination for antiques, visited the shop on a whim. She was immediately captivated by the mirror. Its craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever seen, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to her. "How much for the mirror?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. Mr. Ralston hesitated, his usual smile fading. "This piece is unusual," he said. "It's not for everyone." "I'll take it," Jenny insisted, undeterred. The mirror was delivered to her home that evening, and she hung it in her bedroom. The first incident. That night, Jenny awoke to a faint tapping sound. Groggy, she scanned the room, her eyes landing on the mirror. In its surface, she saw her own reflection sitting up in bed. But something was off. The reflection's movements were not perfectly synchronized with hers. It was subtle at first, but as she moved, she noticed the reflection lagging slightly behind, as if watching her before imitating her actions. "Just a trick of the light," she muttered, lying back down. But sleep didn't come easily. Over the next few days, the mirror's peculiarities intensified. Objects would appear in its reflection that weren't in the room. A vase of dead flowers, a shadowy figure standing in the corner. Jenny's unease grew, but she convinced herself it was stress or her imagination. A dark presence. One evening, as Jenny graded papers at her desk, she glanced at the mirror. This time, her reflection didn't move at all. Instead, it stared at her with a sinister smile. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The smile widened, revealing unnaturally sharp teeth. Then the reflection raised a hand and pointed directly at her. Jenny spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the room was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, her reflection was normal again. Shaken, she covered the mirror with a sheet and decided to sleep on the couch. Seeking answers. The next day, Jenny returned to the antique shop, demanding answers. Mr. Ralston's expression turned grim as she recounted her experiences. "I tried to warn you," he said. "That mirror has a history. It's said to be a gateway, a conduit for something on the other side. Most people who've owned it, they don't last long." "A gateway to what?" Jenny pressed. "Something dark," he replied. "I'll take it back if you want. Destroying it isn't an option. The mirror, it won't allow that." Jenny refused to part with it. Despite her fear, she felt an inexplicable connection to the mirror, as if it held answers she desperately needed. She decided to research its origins, diving into local archives and online forums. The mirror's history. Jenny discovered that the mirror had belonged to a 19th century occultist named Elias Blackthorne, who was notorious for his experiments with the supernatural. According to legend, Blackthorne had used the mirror in rituals to communicate with spirits, but something had gone wrong. After his mysterious death, the mirror passed through various owners, all of whom met untimely and often gruesome ends. Determined to break the cycle, Jenny sought the help of a paranormal investigator, Dr. Victor Ellsworth. He arrived at her home armed with cameras, EMF detectors, and an assortment of protective talismans. The investigation. As night fell, Dr. Ellsworth set up his equipment in Jenny's bedroom. The mirror, still covered, seemed to radiate a palpable energy. When the sheet was removed, the room's temperature plummeted, and the air grew heavy. "It's definitely active," Ellsworth said, his voice steady but tense. "Whatever's attached to it is powerful." The investigation took a chilling turn when the mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a breeze. A shadowy figure emerged, its form indistinct but undeniably malevolent. The cameras captured the moment as the entity stepped out of the mirror, its presence filling the room with an oppressive darkness. Jenny and Ellsworth backed away, clutching their talismans. The figure spoke, its voice a guttural growl. "You cannot banish me," it said. "The mirror is mine, and now so are you." The final confrontation. Ellsworth recited an incantation, the words resonating through the room. The figure recoiled, its form flickering. Enraged, it lashed out, shattering the cameras and knocking Ellsworth to the ground. Jenny grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass cracked, and the entity let out a deafening screech before vanishing. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting. Ellsworth groaned as he sat up, his face pale. "It's not over," he warned. "As long as the mirror exists, it will find a way back." Aftermath, Jenny moved the mirror to her attic, unable to bring herself to destroy it despite Ellsworth's warnings. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was now irrevocably tied to it. Over time, the disturbances lessened, but she knew the mirror's dark influence still lingered. Years later, when Jenny passed away, the mirror was sold at an estate sale to an unsuspecting buyer. And so, the cycle began again. In the spring of 2024, an investigative journalist named Leah Torres moved to Hollow Creek, a small, unassuming suburb in upstate New York. She'd been drawn there by rumors of a peculiar phenomenon. Residents of one particular street, Ravenwood Lane, had been abandoning their homes overnight. Entire families disappeared without a trace, leaving behind fully furnished houses, uneaten meals, and even running cars. The street's eerie silence had earned it the nickname the Ghost Block. Leah, known for her relentless pursuit of the truth, rented one of the empty houses on Ravenwood Lane to investigate. She was determined to uncover the mystery of why so many people had fled. The first night Leah arrived late in the evening, her car packed with cameras, recording devices, and a week's worth of supplies. The house was immaculate, as if the previous occupants had intended to return at any moment. A pot of dried-up stew still sat on the stove, and a calendar on the fridge displayed the date, March 12, 2022, over 2 years earlier. After unpacking, Leah set up her equipment. She placed motion-activated cameras in every room and voice recorders in the hallways. As night fell, she sat at the kitchen table, reviewing her notes by the dim light of a desk lamp. Outside, the street was unnervingly quiet, devoid of the usual suburban sounds of dogs barking or cars passing by. Around midnight, the silence was broken by a faint tapping. Leah froze, her pen hovering above her notebook. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the front door. Gathering her courage, Leah grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached. When she opened the door, no one was there. The street stretched out before her, empty and shrouded in mist. As she turned to go back inside, she noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and her ears buzzed with a low hum. Shaking it off, she locked the door and went to bed. The shadow in the window. The next morning, Leah reviewed the footage from her cameras. Most of it was uneventful, but one clip caught her attention. At 3:15 a.m., the camera in the living room recorded a faint shadow moving across the window. The shape was human-like, but elongated, its movements unnatural. Leah rewound the footage several times, her unease growing. Determined to find answers, she spent the day interviewing the few remaining residents of Hollow Creek. Most were reluctant to talk about Ravenwood Lane. One elderly man, Mr. Greaves, finally relented. "It's the voices," he said, his hands trembling. "They call to you at night. whisper your name, promise things you can't resist. Those who listen, they're never seen again. Leah pressed for more details, but Mr. Greaves shook his head and refused to say anything further. As she walked back to her house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The voices begin. That night, Leah stayed up late, poring over old news articles and property records. She discovered that Ravenwood Lane had been built on the site of a 19th century asylum that burned down in 1893. Many patients and staff perished in the fire, and their remains were never recovered. At 2 a.m., Leah heard it. A faint whispering, like the rustle of leaves. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She grabbed her recorder and followed the sound, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder as she descended into the basement. The basement was cold and damp, its concrete walls lined with shelves of canned goods left behind by the previous occupants. In the corner stood a wooden door she hadn't noticed before. The whispers emanated from behind it. Summoning her courage, Leah opened the door. The hidden room behind the door was a small, windowless room. In its center stood a table with a single flickering candle. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the concrete as if by clawed hands. On the table lay a stack of yellowed papers. Leah picked them up and began to read. The papers were journals from the asylum's head physician, Dr. Elias Crowther. They described his experiments on the patients, which he believed could unlock the secrets of the human soul. The journals grew increasingly erratic, detailing how the patients began hearing voices and seeing figures in the shadows. Dr. Crowther claimed he had opened a door to another realm, but he never explained how he did it. As Leah read, the whispers grew deafening. She looked up to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It had no discernible features, only a vaguely human shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. Leah stumbled backward, dropping the papers. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. "Leave," it rasped, its voice a guttural echo. "This is not your place." The escaped Leah fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind her. The whispers followed, now interspersed with disembodied laughter. She grabbed her car keys and bolted out the front door, not bothering to lock it. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the shadowy figure standing in the middle of the street, watching her leave. The hum in her ears grew louder until she thought her head might split. When she crossed the town's border, the noise stopped abruptly. The aftermath, Leah returned to the city and published her findings, but few believed her story. Ravenwood Lane was eventually sealed off by the local government, deemed unsafe due to structural hazards. The remaining residents of Hollow Creek either moved away or refused to speak of the street again. Leah couldn't escape the experience. She often woke in the middle of the night to faint whispers, her name carried on an unseen wind. The shadow in the mirror, the hum in her ears. They were constant reminders of what she had left behind on Ravenwood Lane. And deep down, she knew that the door Dr. Crowther had opened could never truly be closed.